Hi, my name is Bethany Wiseman. I'm a learning strategist with the Center for Accessible Learning at Algonquin College. Today, I'd like to talk to you about Study Smart, how to improve your study strategies. This is a workshop that we offer through the Student Learning Center. This is just a recorded version that you can access asynchronously. What we'll do today is focus on the 6 most effective ways to learn according to research. And then what we'll do is we'll look at a lot of different study strategies and try to tie them back to those 6 most effective ways to learn so that you can sort of figure out why are these strategies may be effective. The real takeaway, I think, from today's workshop is you're not going to incorporate all of the advice that I'm giving you. I'm going to give you all sorts of different um, you know, things that you could try. They're not all going to be relevant to you as a learner. They're not all going to be particularly useful for your program. So what you really need to do as you work through this workshop is think, do I think this would work for me? And also, um, does it work with the material that I actually need to learn? And then we'll wrap up with a few final tips at the end of the workshop as well. So often when I talk to students about studying, I start by asking the question, how do you study? And almost all of the time, students will mention the word reading. They will say, I read over my notes. They will say, I read over my textbook. And if they don't use the word read, they'll use a word that essentially means read. They'll say, I look over or I review. And really, reading is not a very effective way to study. And I like this cartoon. I found it years ago and I'm still using it because I think it really resonates with a lot of people. Most people, when they're reading a textbook or through or they're reading through their notes, that information goes from the book through their head and it's gone forever, right? And how many times have you sat down and looked over your notes or looked over your textbook and maybe it's a 30-page chapter of your textbook and you're reading and you're saying, yeah, I get it. Okay. Yeah. I remember that. That's from lecture. Yeah. 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 I got it. I got it. I got it. And you get all the way through to the end and you close the book and you've read 30 pages. Maybe it took you 2 or 3 hours and you close the book and you say, now what did I just learn? And maybe you can recite back a few things that you learned, but probably most people's experience when they do that is, wow, I invested that time and energy and I'm not taking away as much as I would like to. And there's an interesting thing that happens when you read, and it's something called the illusion of competence. And basically, what that means is in the moment, as you're reading, everything makes sense to you, right? It's being presented in a pretty straightforward way. They're giving you lots of examples. And often, what that happens, it kind of gives you the illusion, like a sense, but the sense isn't real, that you've learned the material. And really what's happening there in the moment is you're understanding it in the moment and you haven't really retained it fully. Okay. So for that reason, reading isn't really the best way to study, but you can't study without reading. So there's this bit of a paradox, right? What you really need to do is try to incorporate ways of learning that are a little bit more active as you read so that you're getting even more out of the experience of reading. You don't want to go into an exam and sit down and not know what you know and what you don't know, which is what happens if you are only solely trying to study by reading. Now, other things that students will say when I say, how do you study? They'll say things like, well, I rewrite my notes. Or, sometimes as I summarize my notes, I condense them down. I memorize things. I memorize terms and definitions or diagrams. And people will say, I highlight the important things. And research has shown that these study techniques, although they're popular, and although sometimes they can make you feel like you are preparing and you're doing all the things you need to do, they're um, they're not as effective as we think. And it can be really hard as a student sometimes to let go of certain things that you've always done. Maybe you've always rewritten your notes as part of your study process, and you've always, with those rewritten notes, highlighted information. And if you've always done that, it can be hard to take that leap of faith and try something new. Even though research shows that that's effective, it kind of can feel like, oh, if I don't do this thing that I've always done, what if I do worse? So part of what I'm going to try to convince you of today is to try that thing that's new, even if it's something small, even if it's just tweaking what you already do, to try to find a little bit more success when it comes to writing tests and exams. Overall, the message is you have to study actively, you have to practice. Those are the things that are going to lead to better results when it comes to tests and exams. So while studying, you want to study actively, and I'll start off by talking a little bit about what studying actively isn't. Studying actively isn't just doing the reading. It isn't just reading and rereading texts or notes, or highlighting or memorizing. What studying actively is constructing meaning from the text. So as you read, trying to build a picture in your mind about how does all of this information maybe fit together. You're trying to connect things. So how does what I read in the textbook, how does that connect to what I've learned in lecture, or maybe how does it connect to other courses that I've taken in my program? What you want to do is try to come up with examples or find examples that will help you remember the information better. You want to test yourself and get practice. And this is something this really should be highlighted on this particular slide. I'm going to come back to over and over again today. You have to self-quiz. You really have to get that practice quizzing yourself to figure out what you know and what you don't know. And then finally, monitoring your learning as well. And that's asking yourself as you go, do I understand this? Am I getting it right? Do I need some help? How do I find that information that maybe I'm sort of lacking going into this test? So as I mentioned, research shows there are 6 most effective ways to learn. And this was sort of done by an analysis of all the research that's out there by a group of cognitive psychologists. And what they did was they looked at the research and they tried to group things together. So the research out there that had lots of different study strategies, but when they looked at it more closely, what they realized was that those study strategies fell into particular sort of categories. And they were able to come up with 6 categories that sort of generalized all of those other study strategies. The most important are the first 2 that I'm going to talk about. If you change anything at all, these are the things that I really want you to focus on changing, because a lot of times students that I work with, if they make these changes, they'll notice an increase in their marks of, like as high as a letter grade or 2 without making any other changes. Okay, so they have the biggest impact. That's why I'm going to spend the most time on them. And then I'll sort of group the other ones before moving on to the examples. So the very first one is something called retrieval practice. And this is really just a fancy way of saying you need to practice remembering the information. Don't just read it. Reading is very passive. You have no idea what's going to stick in your brain and what's not going to stick in your brain until you're in a test situation, which is a terrible place to figure out that you haven't learned something or you haven't understood something. Okay, so retrieval practice, practicing remembering that information. This is the example that I love to give to students. So you can imagine you're writing an exam and you're answering a particular question, and the information that you need to answer that question is at the other end of one of these 2 pathways, right? So you're sitting there, you've got to walk in on one of these pathways to get the information. I'll pose the question to you. What pathway would you want to be sitting in front of in that particular situation? And I mean, it's a bit of a trick question, and most students are going to say the one on the right. Right? The one that's a clearly defined pathway is the pathway that I want the information on the other end in. Because what you're going to do is you're going to walk in on that pathway, clear where you're going. You're going to get to a clearing. There's going to be a tree, and the sunlight is going to be shining down on the tree, and the information that you need is going to be just right there, right? And you're going to grab that information. You're going to walk out on the pathway. You're confidently going to write that information down on the test or select it if it's a multiple choice question. And you're going to say, I got that one right. I'm 95% sure. And with confidence, you're going to then go on to the next question. Right. And I mean, not every question is going to be like that on the test, but you want as many as possible to sort of be, to give you that experience, right? I walk in, I get the information I need, I walk out, I put that information down on my test. The other pathway, is there even a pathway there, right? It looks a little overgrown. I'm going to wander in there. Maybe I get lost. Maybe I find 3 pieces of information and I say, I don't know, it could be one of these 3. I guess I'm just going to have to guess. And you pick up one of the pieces of information, maybe kind of randomly, and you put it on the test and you go on to the next question. And that's not a good feeling, right? Because you're not sure, did I get that right or did I not get it right? So then the question I always ask students is, well, how does a pathway like the one on the right-hand side picture, how does that get formed? And really, it gets formed by use, right? In nature, you walk on a pathway, right? You walk in, you walk out, other people walk on it, and it creates this pathway where really like nothing is going to grow, over years. If it's not used, for sure, it's going to grow over, but it is a pretty permanent pathway, right? As long as it's maintained. And pathways in our brains, neural pathways, essentially are the same, right? They get formed by use. You go in on that pathway where the information is stored, you pick up the information you need, and you come out with it. So really what's required is that repetition, right? In, get the information, out again. And it's not unlike playing a musical instrument, right? Or playing a sport. If you're learning new skills in those areas, what you're doing is you're practicing drills. At first, you're terrible. You can't do it. You break down the skill into the component parts. You put it back together. You get some feedback from a coach, and you do it over and over and over again. And finally, it comes together, right? And finally, you get to the point where you can't even remember not being able to do that thing. And really, you have to approach school and learning and studying for tests in exactly the same way. You need that repetition. And really, the best way to do that is through the retrieval practice, right? Quizzing yourself. Or if you're not very good at that, if you are a more social learner, maybe having someone else help you with that, whether they're in your program, the peer tutor, or maybe even it's a family member or a friend who's not in your program, but who can sort of help to quiz you. So when you review material, don't just read. This is the number one takeaway I'm telling you today. Don't just read, actually create some study questions for yourself and make sure that you answer them. Okay, and you can do this with any material. What I'm going to do is I'm going to demo it with some handwritten notes, but you can do this with handwritten notes, with PowerPoints, with your textbook, really with whatever, and I'll show you a couple of examples of those things in a minute. So the handwritten note here is about functions of the blood, and there's some information about what are the functions of the blood right below it. And what you would do is, as you are reading through your notes, because you do have to read, even though it's not the most effective way to study, you're going to read through and you're going to find that chunk of this information is grouped together, and I can come up with a corresponding question about it. Okay, so with this chunk of information, the question is, what are the functions of the blood? And there are 3 of them, right? So what I would do is write that study question down either in the margin of your notes or, on the PowerPoint slides digitally. There are a couple of different options, which I'll go back to in a few slides. And then what you do before you move on is you try to read that information to understand it and be able to answer that question. Then you test yourself. Okay, so what you're going to do is you are going to cover up the information, or you're going to close your eyes, or you're going to walk away. I learn really well by pacing. So sometimes I walk away from the information and I'll try to verbalize it out loud, or you can write it down. You can just jot it. So, I've read over that. I'm going to try to answer it. So, what are the functions of the blood? First of all, I know that blood is responsible for distribution, right? It carries different things around the body. And those things include hormones, oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, wastes. I also know that the blood protects the body because there are platelets in the blood. And so if I cut myself and I start to bleed, the platelets are going to clot my blood so I don't bleed out. And also, there are white blood cells in my blood, and white blood cells can um, fight against different pathogens or other things that are not supposed to be in my body, other things that could do me harm. And I don't remember the other one. Okay. And that's where I'm going to come back to my information. I'm going to open my eyes or maybe uncover the information, and I'm going to say regulation. Okay. You know what? I don't even know what that means. My quizzing has made me discover I don't even know what that means. Regulation. So I'm going to read what's there. That means the examples of that are maintaining temperature, maintaining pH, maintaining blood volume. So maintain, I mean, I kind of understand that. Maintains means keeping something sort of the same. So I mean, that's related to regulation. Regulating, I guess, could mean keeping things the same in the body. So I reread that, okay, and those things are temperature and pH and blood volume. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to that question again. What are the functions of the blood? I'm going to cover up those answers and I'm going to try to produce it again. I can tell you at the end of the day, when people are tired, when people are trying to do a little bit of review, maybe for an upcoming midterm, most people are not self-quizzing like this. Why? Because it takes energy, right? And that sometimes at the end of the day, we're like, well, I know that I need to study for this upcoming midterm, but I'm tired and I have a bit of a headache, and tomorrow I'll maybe look at the teacher's review, but tonight I'm just going to read through things. And it actually, you're getting more value if you can convince yourself to slow down and try to quiz yourself instead of just rushing through and reading passively. This is much more active, and it's going to tell you a lot more about what you know and what you don't know and what you need to focus on moving forward. Now, I will point out at this point, you could create cue cards. That's classic retrieval practice, right? Is on one side is a term and then a definition, or a question and then the answer to that question. I do not historically endorse cue cards. And again, why is that? Because I'm just saying this is classic retrieval practice, and retrieval practice is good. The problem with cue cards is they take forever. They take a really, really long time to make. And I've seen so many students over the years, if they have 10 hours devoted to studying for this midterm, they'll spend 6 or 7 of the hours creating the cue cards, and they haven't learned that material, and then they don't have enough time to study. So I say, do it the lazy way, which is do your cue cards right in your notes, where you're not rewriting anything. You're just creating study questions on the material you already have. Now, I'm doing this recording and things are probably going to change, but very recently I did notice in Quizlet, which is it's a way of making electronic or digital cue cards that you can use either web-based or on a cell phone. Quizlet now has an AI feature where you can plug in your PowerPoints and it will spit out cue cards based on the PowerPoints. Mixed results. I'm going to be honest with you. Sometimes really accurate and great, and then other times so-so, or it's taking half a sentence on one side of the cue card and it's putting the second half of the sentence on the other. So, I mean, there are bugs there. If you decided to use something like this, it would save you time, but you would also have to spend a little bit of time cleaning up the cue cards that AI is spitting out for you. Again, I think things are changing fast. I think it's going to get refined pretty quickly. So it might be something that you want to create a free Quizlet account and give it a try. Can you create study questions on your PowerPoint slides? Absolutely. This is a great way of using the same retrieval practice principle. So what you're doing in this case is you're taking a slide, you're reading over the material on that slide, you're asking yourself, if this material was the answer to a question, what would the question be? And then you're writing down that question to use it later on. So you can see on this particular slide, cognition is a definition. The term is the cognition is the term, and then the definition is how people think and understand. So my study question is going to be, what is cognition? What is cognition? It's how people think and understand. There are 4 stages of cognitive development. I'm going to ask myself, what are Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development? And a follow-up question to that might be, what are the characteristics of each stage? Because you probably need to know that as well. Most slides, you will have 1 to 4 questions. All right, based on the information that's there. It really just depends how much the professor is trying to pack in. Sometimes professors are kind to us, and they'll actually make the question the title of the slide, right? And then, wow, your job is done. You just have to identify that as the question that you're going to answer. I say that these are lazy person's cue cards. As a learning strategist, I am all about value for the time and effort that you spend on school. And creating study questions directly onto the material you have is great value for the time that you're spending, because then any additional time you use to study those questions and to learn the material associated with those questions. And these are just some examples of where you could write the study questions. So personally, I print notes. I don't think many people do that anymore. It's a bit old-fashioned. I really learn better when I have a piece of paper in front of me, when I have something that I can hold that's tangible. So for me, I would print slides in a handout form. Maybe even I've created notes on these slides from lectures themselves, but I would use those same slides to create study questions, and I could write those questions either just above, to the side in the margin, or below on the actual handout. If you're looking at digital notes, for instance, you could download your PowerPoint from Brightspace and write the questions in the notes section, or you could even insert a text box, and maybe all of your study questions are going to be in hot pink or purple or lime green, something that stands out as being not a part of the original slide, and you're going to write that right onto the slide itself. Or if you're using something like OneNote, obviously you can use the same concept there for the digital note and just create those study questions for yourself, so you can very easily find them and use them as you're studying. So one strategy that's related to retrieval practice is the stoplight study technique, which is used to prioritize what you need to focus on as you're preparing for a test or an exam. And it's related to retrieval practice because with retrieval practice, you are monitoring your learning, right? You are going through and you're figuring out, what do I know? What do I not know so well? And then with stoplight, you're categorizing that so that you can go back and you can put more time and effort on the information that is maybe not as clear to you. So as you're going through and quizzing yourself, what you're going to do is classify things as being red, yellow, or green. This is the colors of a stoplight. Green is the material that you know really well. You feel very confident. The greens are the things that you're like, please let this be on the test, right? Because I will for sure get that information right if I have a question on it. The yellows are the things that you partially know. Okay, I partly know it, but maybe I'm unclear on part of the concept, or maybe there are 2 similar concepts and I have a hard time telling them apart. And that can be very dangerous. especially on multiple choice tests, right? Where you're either right or wrong, and there are going to be some distractors there to pull your attention away. And then the red material is the stuff that you really don't know. Maybe you don't even remember the professor talking about it, or like you can't produce it. Maybe like you're like, oh, I remember the prof talking about it, but like I can't say anything about this topic. I can't generate any information about it myself. I'd have to look at my notes to be able to tell you anything. Now, I know when I was a university student and I started in a science program, really I studied everything pretty equally, which looking back was not a very good strategy. What I would do is I'd start at the beginning of my notes and I would review, and I'd get to the end of my notes and I'd say, okay, it's still 4 days before the exam. And I would go back to the beginning again, and then I would go through, and I would do that basically until I ran out of time. And like it just wasn't a very effective use of my time because um, I wasn't recognizing that the green light material, studying that over and over again, wasn't actually going to improve my chances of getting a better mark. Where you can get a better mark is by focusing on the reds and the yellows, right? Trying to make some of the yellows greens, trying to make some of the reds yellows, that shift towards the green. You are probably never going to go into an exam with everything in the green. I mean, I've been a student for a really long time, and I really can't think of many exams where I've gone in that confident about all of the material. And I mean, sometimes it is a bit of a crapshoot, right? Like, what is the professor going to ask you about? Because maybe there are things that you don't know anything about, and oh, there's just not on the exam. It's my lucky Dan didn't get tested on that. And in other cases, there might be things that I don't know that well, and I'm banking on it not being on the exam, and then there are a few questions on it, and you lose those marks. So, there is always that unpredictability. You can't know for sure that what you're learning is what's going to be targeted on the exam. But really, by focusing on the reds and the yellows, you're giving yourself the best chance to perform well on the exam. Okay. Some people don't like this strategy because they're really afraid of forgetting the greens. Like, if I don't keep going back to the greens, maybe I'm going to forget it. And that's where I'm banking on getting the marks. Again, this is one of those strategies where you have to have faith in your ability to remember it. And I'm not telling you to never go back and look at the greens again. I'm telling you that skip the greens, focus on the reds and the yellows, and then periodically come back to the greens. Like maybe every third time you go through, come back to the greens, or maybe the night before the exam, come back to the greens. And then it's a big confidence booster right before the exam because you're looking at material that you're pretty comfortable with. So again, you're not going to spend an equal amount of time on all material. First, you're going to review everything. And then after that, you're going to focus on the reds and the yellows. I do want to normalize the amount of time that it does take to retain information, because this is a big concern. I'll have students come in and they'll say to me, I don't know what's wrong with me. I review my material and I just can't remember it. And, we'll sort of unpack that a little bit. And sometimes what comes out is they've gone over the material a handful of times. What research says about memory is that you do need to go over material probably in the range of 7 to 10 times before you're going to be able to retain it. And you may be sitting there going like, I can't review my material 7 to 10 times before the exam. That's where the pre-work comes into play, right? Because the 7 to 10 times includes, okay, I read my textbook before the class, and then I went to class, and then I met with my study group to review the material. And then there was a quiz on that material, so I studied for it. So throughout the semester, you're actually building up that number as you go, if you're doing the work as you go, right? And instead of just like doing it all right before the exam. And I do want to normalize it because, you could be on the upper end of that. you might need 10 times of seeing that material and working with it or applying it before you actually have that really sunk into your brain, right? You might even be beyond that range. Maybe it takes you 12 times or 13 or 14 times. So you have to put in the amount of time that you need in order to learn the material, especially if you're looking to retain it long term, which hopefully most people are if they're here in a college program wanting to work in the field afterwards. So what does using Stoplight look like? Really, you can do it any way that works for you. If it's hard copy of notes that you're working with, you could use highlighters or a pencil crayon, crayons, and just sort of like do a little dot in that color, or RYG for red, yellow, green. If you're using digital copies, you could change the font color of the heading, or you could drop in, like, insert little shapes of particular colors. And then as you go through a second time and you're self-quizzing and learning that material and feeling more confident with it, what you're doing is actually crossing it out and changing the color. So hopefully some of those yellows again are becoming greens, maybe some of the reds are becoming yellows, and you should see your progress over the course of the time that you're studying. You should see that you have learned more and more of the material. Okay, so back to the 6 most effective ways to learn. The second category here, and I told you, remember that the first 2 categories really do make the biggest difference for most students, is something called spaced practice, which is actually something probably that your teachers have been telling you for a really, really long time, which is study a little at a time, not all at once. Don't cram, don't do everything the night before the exam. Do it a little bit at a time, not all at once. So ideally, you study throughout the semester. And that really can help you be better prepared for tests and exams, for final projects as well, if you're more in a project-based uh, program. It's all about investing time and effort and reaping the rewards of this later. And I have to say, I didn't really adhere to this very well until I was a part-time student working full-time and I had kids. And that's when I started studying and reviewing notes and doing self-quizzing at the gym. In the morning, I'd go for an hour, and the first half hour, I'd just sit on a stationary bike and I would quiz myself. And it wasn't a great workout, but I was there and I was moving my body, which was good. And I was also putting in some time for school. And then I would do a half an hour of a workout after that. And what that forced me to do is put in, really like 2-3 hours per week of reviewing notes from whatever course I happened to be taking. Um, and that put me in a position where I didn't have to study as much when it came to midterms and finals. Because really what I was doing, if I would study for 10 or 15 hours for that midterm, I was spacing it out over time instead of doing it in that single week before the exam. And don't forget, what you want to do is combine space practice with retrieval practice, and use those self-quizzing techniques. So as you're doing your studying over time, spaced out over time, what you're going to do is quiz yourself as you go. So don't just reread your notes. When you are using space practice, you are going to forget some material. And that's a big thing I hear from students. They'll say, I don't want to start too early studying because I'm just going to forget the material. And my answer to that is, yeah, and that's actually a good thing, right? We think in learning or in education as of forgetting as being a bad thing. But forgetting is actually part of the learning process. Okay, so if you can see this chart here, this graph, when you first learn something and you're at 100%, okay, I just learned that, it's really fresh. Within about 3 days, you've dropped down and now you only remember about 60% of what you learned. Okay, and that continues to drop. It doesn't just stop at 60, it continues to drop over time. But what you'll notice is if you review that material and you go back up to 100%, you're going to forget it again, which is really demoralizing, right? But Look at the curve. Look at the slope of the line. It now takes you 6 days instead of 3 to lose that material and go down to 60%. And if you review it again, it's going to take you even longer to forget, right? So that's huge. Over time, you're relearning and you're retaining that information for longer. And I will point out, it never takes as long to relearn material, right? You've had that experience where you've learned something for a midterm and then you've forgotten it for the final and you review it. It doesn't take very long to relearn. And every time you relearn it, it takes less and less time. It's more like, oh, a reminder of it. So it's going to go faster each time and you're going to remember it longer. And you know what? I'm going to appeal to your better self here. You're in a college program, I hope, not just to get a diploma and get out of here and get a job. I mean, although that's the benefit of it, hopefully you want to leave here with the information and the skills that will allow you to perform well in your field. That's the ideal, right? I will say this, studying is hard. Okay. People will come to me and they'll say, I'm doing something wrong. This feels like too much work. And if it feels like there's a lot of effort involved, you're probably doing something right. Okay. So keep on doing that thing. All right. The next group I'm going to talk about as a bit of a package. So elaboration is explaining and describing ideas with as many details as possible. Right. So not just saying, oh, mitosis. Yeah. That's cell division. That's where a cell splits. Saying mitosis is cell division. I'm going to start with one cell and I'm going to end up with 2. And the process involves a number of stages, interphase, prophase, metaphase, and being able to describe what happens in each of those phases. That's elaboration, providing detail. Another one of the 6 most effective ways to learn is using concrete examples, making links between ideas and examples. I remember examples way better than I remember theories. If I have an example and then I can say that theory is I can hook that theory right on the example, I'm going to remember it a lot better. I love it when professors tell stories. When they tell stories and give examples, I'm writing those things down. Even though I might not be tested specifically on those things, when I go to study, I'm going to be able to remember the theories a lot better and then apply them in new ways on the test if I'm asked to do so. And then the next effective way to learn is using something called dual coding, which is just another way of saying you're going to try to learn the information in multiple ways or multiple modalities. So if information is given to you in words, can you put it into some sort of diagram or mind map or a chart? Or could you make a song? Could you put it in a timeline? Whatever you're given, could you put it in a different form that will allow you to remember it a little bit better? So I'm going to show you an example of each of those 3 things. So the first thing is dual coding. This mind map is an example of dual coding, right? Instead of it just being a list of text, you can see that, these are the 6 most effective ways of learning. I've got dual coding, elaboration, concrete example, space practice, and so on. And I have a little diagram there. I have the term. They're all branching out from that central idea. An example of elaboration, and I mean elaboration with retrieval practice, if you're doing it from memory, would be to describe what is spaced practice. And spaced practice is doing your studying or your work a little bit at a time instead of all at once right before it's due. Okay, so you can see my definition there. I can double check. I can monitor my learning and see how I'm doing. And then finally, a concrete example, well, I'll use spaced practice again. A concrete example would be coming up with, like spaced practice in action. So what does that look like? If I have an exam next Wednesday and I'm going to study 8 hours for it, I'm going to study 2 hours Thursday and 2 hours on Friday. I'm going to skip Saturday, and then I'm going to do 2 hours on Sunday and my final 2 hours on Tuesday, the day before the exam. Still studying 8 hours, but it's spaced out over time instead of done all at once. And then finally, I don't spend a lot of time talking about interleaving because I do find that students don't love interleaving. But that's okay. Research does show that it's effective. Interleaving is switching between topics, okay? And a lot of students like to focus on one thing until it's done, and then it's off their plate, and then they like to focus on another thing, and then it's done and it's off their plate. So we'll give you two examples of interleaving. One example would be within the same subject. So for instance, if you're studying math and one day you learn how to add fractions, and then you learn how to subtract fractions, and then you learn how to divide fractions, and you learn how to multiply fractions, and then some word problems with fractions. And then on the test, all of those things are kind of mixed up. Well, if you've only done studying one thing and doing lots of questions on that one thing, and then studying the next thing and doing lots of questions on that thing, and then all of a sudden they're jumbled on the test, you've never given yourself any practice discriminating between, okay, what do I do in this situation versus what do I do in this situation over here? Okay, so interleaving can be helpful with subjects like that, where you on a test are going to be actually assessed on whether or not you can do that thing. Interleaving also could be switching gears and moving between subjects, right? So maybe I have a project for course A and I have a project for course B, and they're both due within a couple of days. It actually is to my benefit to do a little bit of work on project A starting maybe a week or two before, but then not entirely focusing on that one thing, switching gears and maybe doing a little bit of work on project B too, and moving between them. You know, you could have separate days for each project, or you could have, you know, an hour or two per day. It doesn't really matter. But again, moving between those two topics is usually good because you're giving yourself lots of time, you're spacing it out over time, you're giving your brain lots of downtime to process and think on things, even when you're not directly working on it. And I mean, you're making progress on both, right? Which is great in terms of avoiding procrastination. So what I'm going to do at this time is I'm going to say that was part A, and I'm going to stop the recording. And what I'll do is come back and do a part B with some extra ideas for studying lots and lots of different techniques you could be using. And for each one, I'll sort of say what it's an example of when it comes to those 6 most effective ways to learn material. So I hope you'll join me for the second half. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.